All right, we now welcome on Josh Kauten. Josh, appreciate you coming on the show today.
Really appreciate you having me, man.
So are you running your facility full time now?
I am not actually. So I'm kind of in that transitional phase where still doing a day job, transitioned from coaching full time at Heartland Community College and was doing kind of the JUCO thing, right? Doing lessons on the side, trying to scrape by and survive, and got married, had a few kids, and life takes you where it takes you, and got more involved in the private side and still kept my day job throughout that whole thing, trying to make it work. And now actually, so the last couple of years I've been in a job with orthopedic surgery sales, which is kind of cool. With my degree in kinesiology, it really allowed me to kind of understand the human body even to a further degree. And then locally, it's been kind of cool to really have that full circle of care for my athletes, where, if there's always a disconnect, right? Guy gets hurt, guy calls off ortho, they can maybe see him next week or two. He says, PT, they see the physical therapist, physical therapy clears him. And then he goes back to high school coach, and high school coach is like, all right, now what? He's like, I don't know, I'm cleared. So when he's really nowhere near, like if it was like an ACL, he's cleared. All right, put him in practice, let's go. But from a overhead thrower, clearing PT means you're not even close to being back on the field. So it's been nice to have that circle of network where I can kind of communicate with the doctors. And, from a nerd perspective, it was pretty cool to be in the surgeries and see knee replacements, hip replacements, and get a better understanding of human anatomy and functional anatomy and how it all ties together. So when I was in the OR, I would kind of always have the baseball brain on, of thinking like, man, how does this guy's hip anatomy affect if he was going to be a baseball player? So I'm still in wound care. I'm still in a medical sales, just in a different field during the day, and then doing the academy stuff at night.
You said, eventually, do you want to do the facility full time, or do you like kind of having a little bit of both?
I think always the goal is to try to get to purely baseball, right? But like I said, family comes into play, and sometimes your priorities are shooken up a little bit. And obviously I love being in there, but I'm to the point where my kids are 8, 5, and 2. So they're starting to get into PM activities. And so I'm going to be less and less available in the evenings and weekends. So always trying to ride that, like, that fine line of, I want to be in, but at the same time, I want to work with my kids as well. And don't want to be the absent dad either. So it's always that fine line of baseball coach versus dad.
Yeah, I'm sure I don't have kids, but I'm sure that's a tough balance. Do you have coaches who work underneath you at your facility?
Yeah, we have lots of coaches, tons of I wouldn't say we don't have any quote unquote full-time coaches right now. We've got a lot of Heartland Community College is here in town. So a lot of their assistant coaches and head coaches head coach will help do some lessons on the side and run some of our programs. We work with some other strength conditioning guys that kind of lead our strength conditioning program. And then we have a lot of blended guys that will do, they're not maybe full-time yet, but getting there, where they're doing maybe lessons one day, strength and training the other day, and then doing some admin work during the day. So like I said, we're kind of a newer business, so to speak. Our business model, we're growing really fast, and we're trying to keep up with the demands of staffing. But
how long have you been doing the training, strength conditioning at your facility and everything? Like, when did you start your business?
Yeah, so I got drafted in 2004 out of Illinois State, played with the Tigers for 3 years and in indie ball for 2. And so I finished up my last year of playing in 2008. And that was when Heartland Community College had just started their program the year prior. And Nate Metzger, who's now at Wright State as their associate head coach, was the head AD and head coach, and knew me being around and asked if I was interested in coaching. And of course, when you're playing, you don't want to think about plan B, right? Plan A is the only plan. But writing was probably on the wall that things weren't going where I wanted them to go. And so I ended up saying yes. And I was kind of coaching remotely that first, I was finishing my playing career, and they were there on campus in August. So that first month I was sending a lot of programs back and forth and coaching remotely. So kind of from there, my degree is in exercise science and kinesiology. So it was kind of a blessing in disguise, I suppose, where I was the head strength coach and the pitching coach for all 6 years. And so I was doing both. And it was kind of a blessing in disguise, because a lot of times you get silos, right? Where maybe strength guy doesn't, and it's gotten a lot better in recent years, but like strength guy maybe doesn't understand the pitching movement or the hitting movement. Maybe pitching guy doesn't understand strength conditioning principles, and maybe they hate each other, or maybe there's just not communication where, you've got, this is what we're doing. We're doing upper body lift today, and we're doing upper body focus lift today. And, didn't communicate that, oh, he has a bullpen later today. Right. So, just being able to control both ends of it, I think really made a pretty good system, because I was pretty good communication with myself a lot. But it was a blessing and a curse. And as I started to look at like other opportunities down the road, I think people kind of wanted me to pick one, right? Like, are you a pitching coach? Are you a strength coach? And again, we're talking 08, 09, all the way up to like 12 and 14. I was like, well, my answer was always both. And I felt like being a good strength coach made me a better pitching coach. And I felt like being a good pitching coach made me a better strength coach, understanding a lot of the similarities between the two and how they played off each other. Because I felt like I could make a lot of mechanical improvements in the weight room, just by driving that, versus just, hey, let's work on drills. Being able to really drive, movement changes through the weight room was huge.
What's something that you see as a strength coach when you are on social media? I know obviously you're on social media. I know that's where we first connected. But what do you see that could be improved from the strength conditioning realm for developing baseball players across the board? I mean, across all over the country.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I don't think anybody has a good answer right now in terms of, one of the things that I always see out there is the debated college versus run polls for mental strengthening, like, we know that running polls forever and all that isn't going to elicit a better athlete per se in terms of their physical attributes. But I do think there's something to be said for pushing through something that is just mentally unbearable and tough, because that's what baseball is, right? It's sometimes mentally unbearable and tough. And so trying to, you really find out who is in it and who's willing to push through something that is brutal. And that's, you're going to be in 0 for 10 slumps. You're going to be throwing electric pitches and they dump it into right field for a single, it's trying to be able to mentally grind through it. And so I don't know what the right answer there is in terms of, is running 6 miles the first day when you get back to campus the right answer? Probably not. Is not forcing your athletes to do anything other than like flying tens always the right answer? Probably not. So I don't know where the Omaha challenge or, wherever your destination challenge falls. I think that's probably that's one that I see that's always a hot spot on social media that I don't know that I've seen a good answer yet for. I think we've done a really good job of understanding that, maybe max back squat isn't the best eliciting KPI for a pitcher, for a baseball player. And there's a point of diminishing returns of absolute strength. I think that was always kind of one of my sticking points of like, all right, how much stronger does a guy need to be a good pitcher? You know what I mean? But I think the industry's really caught up on that, where it's still fun to see guys throw up, 4 stacks on a squat and move some weight. But I think at a certain point, how much of that training economy of time has made them better on the mound if you're already strong enough. So
what is strong enough?
Yeah, I think it's relative strength. I think everybody's got their own versions, but like, we kind of say, all right, can you trap bar twice your body weight? Can you front squat 1 1/4 your body weight? And so I think there's other KPIs. I think, and there's always variations, right? Like, so you get a guy, like some of my pro guys, right? Like I've got a guy that's like 6'6", 260. Like, does he need to do 520 to be strong enough? Probably not. So it's kind of like, all right, twice your body weight, or I think even Cressy's kind of been out there and said like 450 is kind of his benchmark of strong enough on the trap. So it just, we kind of go off relative body weight, unless you just get like a large human and you're pushing 260, 270 as a big dude. We don't necessarily hard steadfast, the 2X body weight thing, but
Isn't the length of your limbs have something to do with that? The only reason I bring that up is because, for example, like I could trap bar deadlift over 500 pounds, not to, you know, show off or anything, but
humble brag, nice job.
I have I have extremely long arms, so I don't have to go down as far as someone else. And kind of in a sense, I wouldn't cheat obviously, but I didn't have to go up and down as far because of how long my arms are. Like, is that taken into account at all when you talk about just strength training? I know Cressy said 450 or whatnot, but my 450 may be easier to get than you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I mean, if you're long levered and all that, like some things are going to be naturally. So you're dead. I'm similar in terms. I'm a long femur guy with long arms, so deadlift came natural to me. I was anterior pelvic tilt, so I still am, but deadlift again kind of came natural to me, and I had big bang for my buck. But back squat was brutal, right? Long femur guy
Oh,
with anterior tilt, and I was a low bar squatter, and it was just, I sucked at it. It's brutal. Of course, I grew up in the 90s, early 2000s, not to date myself, but it was, a lot of football mentality of get low and grind out. And I think it worked to a certain extent because obviously I made some jumps, but I think towards the end of my career, I think it was a diminishing return for sure in terms of mobility and strength. So yeah, I mean, I of course, like your anatomical setup is going to predispose you to being advantageous in some things and disadvantageous in others. But I think generally speaking, when we talk about baseball players and specifically, pitchers, you start to see some commonalities, and you can kind of say general rules. Like it might not cover 100% of the people,
yeah.
but not the 90%.
So what would be a good way? You said, you brought up the one rep max. Okay, like probably not the best way to go about it, but I mean, if someone can do heavier weight, or is this where the speed comes into play when you're talking about just trying to accelerate faster during the lifts and being able to measure how fast you're moving the bar?
Yeah, and so that's where one of our mantras is assess, don't guess, right? So if we can assess guys where they're at on the velocity force velocity curve and understand where they're at on the speed strength continuum, if they're really strong but they really lack in some of the power output stuff, maybe they're pulling 500 and they've got like a 23-inch vertical, and like their rotational med ball toss is not very good. So understanding where they're at and what type of athlete they are. And again, good coaches are always thieves, right? So I'm going to steal some more stuff, but Bill Parisi is a guy that he really put it into, he had a comment that just really like stuck with me in terms of being able to classify your athletes. And he was talking more about the fascial network and what type of athlete you have that in terms of how they produce their power. But the analogy he uses is elephants, rhinos, and cheetahs. And so we can all picture, let's say we've got three pitchers, an elephant, a rhino, and a cheetah, and they're all throwing 92. So they all throw the same. They're all producing the same amount of force at the end of the day, power output, I should say. But, the 6'6", 260-pound guy that's throwing 92 is probably producing force a little bit differently, right? He's probably a strength kind of guy, producing more pure strength, maybe versus like that elastic whippy motion. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got your 6'2", 175-pound lightning rod arm, right? And he's 92. And those are the guys that we all typically gravitate towards, because you see that frame and you think, okay, if I can put some weight on that, holy cow, what do we got, right? That's more of an upside arm. And then you've got your rhinos, who are kind of the in between, a blend of the brute strength and the elasticity, right? So I always like that analogy visually. It kind of gives me an idea of where athletes are. So how do I use that in real world is, if I've got a quote unquote rhino, strong strong dude, large human. I don't know that I need to give him more strongman stuff. Like he probably needs to hang out with the cheetah a little bit and start to think more, more speed focus on the end of the spectrum, more velocity. And if I've got the cheetah, he probably needs to hang out with the elephant more and do more strength stuff, a little bit more force development type stuff. So just trying to give an athlete, because what we're really talking about is efficiency, right? How fast can I get this athlete as good as he can possibly be? And speed matters. So, getting an athlete good 2 years before he becomes into his own means hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars, right? So if I take a guy that's in college and he's a junior, and you add on all this mass and velocity, like that's really good. But what if you would have added it on when he was a senior in high school and made him a dude? The same 95-mile-an-hour arm at 18 versus 22 is a completely different conversation in terms of that guy's career. So how can we give the athlete that's what they need the most and most appropriate, and how can we accelerate and create really a learning curve efficiency?
So just saying mass equals gas isn't true.
I think not. It's not a hard, fast rule for sure. I think it's need based, right? So 6'2", 165 probably needs some mass and probably get some gas. 6'2", 250, again, point of diminishing returns. Putting 20 pounds on that guy, probably not great.
Have you noticed like the bigger guys, the elephants, maybe they don't get injured as often because they have that natural strength?
I would say no. I mean, I think because a lot of those guys, what we found, especially if they're big at an early age, the guys who we see like just rocket ship and make massive jumps are the guys who are maybe late bloomers, undersized, had to learn how to move well early to compete. So think like just think in the big leagues, like the smaller dudes, like the Stromans, the Sonny Grays, the Yordani Venturas, the guys who were maybe like undersized, but they had to figure out how to move efficiently and well to generate at the smaller size, and then maybe hit like their growth peak later. I mean, those guys are the ones that make like just massive jumps and explode. But the guys who are maybe, 13 years old and 6'2" and had to carry around their birth certificate to prove that they were in the right age category. I've seen a lot of those guys actually develop really poor patterns because the field is short, and what pitching really is momentum generation. And when you're huge and you're short, or when you're huge and you're throwing from a shorter distance, you can get away with really bad patterns because you can just be huge and fall. And, that's how you create power. So a lot of times those bigger guys, when they're big early, they have a lot of trouble later trying to figure out those patterns to use like their lower half efficiently, because they've just always relied on being huge. So,
yeah.
So I wouldn't say like it's an absolute big guys stay healthy. But I would say it's, in my experience, I wouldn't say that would be the case.
I'd love to hear, Josh, I'd love to hear your thoughts on pitch count, because I truly don't understand pitch count, I get it, why it's put into play in a sense, I'm sure, especially at the amateur level where coaches are just trying to win games and, you got guys throwing 3 days in a row. But in terms of just, if you're throwing once a week or whatever it is, I feel like there's so many things that you can't quantify when it comes to a pitcher and if they should continue to throw, unless you have, they're wearing something or some sort of piece of technology, because other than that, it's really just you gauging how stressful that they are, like the environment that they're in, how they're struggling, how they're throwing on the mound, if they're just blowing by batters or not. So I want to hear your thoughts on the pitch count dilemma.
Yeah, I think it's better than nothing.
Was I on, did you agree with what I just said?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I've never said like, oh, 100 pitches, he should shut it down and be done. And I've always kind of innately felt like that. I've thrown games where I'm embarrassed to say that I was like 130 pitches in and I felt great and my velo was holding and I was great. Like, let's go. And I've thrown days where I've been like 95 pitches and I'm like, I don't think I can throw another pitch. Like my arm's going to fall off. And and for whatever reason that may be. But I think having something as simple as a pitch count is at least a guardrail for some of the youth levels, and maybe even the high school levels. But I think people have also, it's kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy a little bit, where we've gotten into this babying of pitchers so much that, yeah, like, oh, we can't, there's no way we could throw more than 60 pitches, like, because of XYZ, and there's no way we could throw long toss this much, and we've got to protect it. And I get all of that, but I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because people train so scared to, really press the envelope from a training perspective, that they are prepared to throw that 100, 110. But back in my day, really dating myself, but back in my day, it was, you just went out and you played catch all the time, and it was free play, right? It was a lot of not restricted practice. I will say, kind of going back, contradicting myself a little bit, is there's so much pressure on these younger guys to be so good so fast. And so I think, one contributing factor to a lot of these injuries is the rate of which, how much force and how hard these guys are throwing, how early. And it's the recruiting game, right? Like, you get guys that are 8th graders and 7th graders, like, verbally committing to these schools, and there's all this pressure to be good on social media and get ranked by somebody. And you got these, like, freshmen in high school pumping out like 90, 92. And there's just no way they're skeletally mature enough to sustain that over a long course of time. But you're right. Like, I'm on the same page as you, is like, towards the end of my career at Heartland, one of the things that we started to do was a modified pitch count, where I never believed a pitch was a pitch, in terms of, like, stress. And this is pre-modus, pre-pulse, where we didn't have a way to measure. But inherently, we knew that, like, the slider was more stressful. We knew that, like, splitters were more stressful. And being a pitcher, having a runner on first that was a plus runner, like, that altered your mechanics. That always made me feel more stressed in terms of, like, maybe not being able to repeat my delivery, which in turn made it a more stressful throw. Pressure situations, like late in the game tying run. And so kind of what we did is I gave, like, a coefficient, so to speak, rather than just a pitch being one. If I deemed it to be a stressful pitch, and I kind of gave it categories, right? Like, if you had to go slide step and you weren't a slide step guy, if you were late, high stress pitches, sliders and splits. And I just threw a random, like, I know it's more stressful, I don't know what the coefficient is. I did 1.5. And at the end of the inning, if it was like a 20 pitch inning, also we did, if you did more than 30 pitches in an inning, every pitch after that was a 1.5. So basically, if you threw like 20 pitches in an inning, but 10 of them were sliders, like, your pitch count to me wasn't 20, it was 30. And so we kind of went off of that more so than, like, just the straight pitch count, because 100 is not 100, right? Like, you get a guy that's in the 7th inning and he's cruising and he's had 2 base runners in 6 innings, versus a guy that's in the 4th and he's had traffic all day, every day. For me, like,
you came up with that on your own?
Yeah, I just made it up. I just kind of used it as a metric, and more so what I did is used it as more as a gauge of my recovery. So if I had a guy that, he threw 100, but his, like, coefficient number was like 110, 115, I'd be like, cool, he's good to go for his full throttle bullpen. But hey, he threw 100, 105, but, like, his coefficient was like 140 because of the high stress pitches. We just backed him off on his side day and just did more of, like, a touch and feel, just to try to monitor his stress. Like, we didn't have technology back then to truly measure it, where Pulse has been great in terms of that, being able to measure workload and acute to chronic workload ratios, and understanding your what you should be trying to target that week for the month, or versus the month. So
Going back to what you were talking about, a freshman throwing 90. It's funny you said that, because I was with my old high school yesterday at Moeller, and they have a freshman who's already throwing 90. If you had a kid, if you're like one of your kids who was a freshman in high school, because you said, like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but believe you said like his skeletal system like isn't really ready for that as a freshman in high school, be able to throw 90 miles an hour. So if your son was throwing 90 as a freshman, what would you do to make sure that he, is going to be healthy in 5 years?
That's a really good question. I think, you know, hopefully my son, if he's throwing 90 as a freshman, I think I would really want to manage his workload. I would be careful to get caught up in the hype of having to go to every showcase, having to go to every event, having to throw every important game, quote unquote, because how many important games does a freshman in high school like really throw? I don't know. And then it would just be the weight room, man. If he's already got the ability to throw 90, it's just really more the ability to sustain that. And so what can we do to solidify that structure, that bone structure? Again, at 14, 15, you really don't have fully closed growth plates. Your bone isn't skeletally mature enough there to be solid. I've seen a lot of increase in like medial epicondyle fractures in that age population, like that 12 to 15 range. They don't really see a lot of UCLs or anything like that. But again, that your bones aren't fully formed at that age, and you're creating these stressful situations. And it's good that your soft tissue is strong enough, but I've seen a lot of not to say a lot, I've seen an increase in medial epicondyle fractures at that age population for sure. So if my kid was 15 and pumping 90, I would just really try to manage his workload, get in the weight room. Again, my wife is 6'3", and
Wow.
she likes to say she's 6'2", but she's 6'3". I like to say I'm 6'4", but I'm 6'3". But my kids are probably going to be predisposed to being tall, lanky. So truly probably packing on some mass and just increasing the bone density would probably be a big focus for sure.
What's your take on running guns, right? What if your kid could throw 90, but he threw 90 because he's at the age as a freshman, because he's been doing all the weighted balls, he's been doing the running guns, he's been doing all this other stuff. Then, like at that point, like was it worth to get to 90 as a freshman, or would you wait till you're a few years older?
That was a lot of questions in one, but I think where I'll start is my son will not be doing weighted ball, quote unquote, running guns at that age. I just think there's lower hanging fruit. And I think it's important to clarify and define weighted balls. I think people blend what weighted balls mean. When I think weighted balls, I think of weighted baseballs that, like the overload, underload that you're throwing at max intent. Versus a lot of people get confused with like plyos. So we use plyos a lot in our programs from a warm-up perspective at a sub-maximal effort. And pending age, we only kind of stay for the most part when we're throwing them forward for the most part in that 16-ounce range, and mostly stay on the overload side. Just from a peak stress standpoint, the underload is really the one that is that peak stress, right? And I think inherently, when we didn't know a lot about weighted balls in the last few years, that's like 7-8 years ago, when they're just kind of becoming repopularized, I should say. Inherently, I was like, man, when I rocket a wiffle ball, it hurts. So I never got on the bandwagon of run and gun in like a 2-ounce light flight. And my gut feel of being kind of that old guy, I guess, kind of kicked in and was right. I think, that peak stress of that super fast movement inherently is more dangerous than, like an overload where you've really spread out the forces of that throw over a longer period of time. So maybe like the total stress is higher, but that peak stress isn't that high where you run into that potential for an acute injury. So I think, with weighted balls, I'm a believer of those at a certain point. Again, skeletally mature. You have relative strength. You've attacked your mobility deficits, if you have any, as best as you can, or you've at least optimized, and you've explored other options in terms of, again, if you can't deadlift your body weight, like I don't care. I don't like why are we picking up a 16-ounce baseball and throwing it as hard as we can? Like to me, that doesn't resonate very well. But so I think to your question, that probably won't happen. So maybe I'll change. He's 5, so I got 10 years, I guess, to change my opinion. And I've changed my opinions on things before, but that one I don't see happening yet.
Josh, you mentioned earlier how when you have players, probably more specific pitchers, are having deficiencies on the mound, mechanical issues, that you fixed a lot of that in the weight room. What are some of the ways that you've gone about helping pitchers out with specific exercises that you see on the mound, but you were able to help them and fix them in the weight room?
Yeah, I think it's very individualized on that front. I think if we take a 10,000-foot view of what do pitchers need to generate a quality movement, like some are, one of the things kind of going, off the grid here, but with my orthopedic experience, one of the most eye-opening things was seeing all of the different hips that are out there in terms of, some hips are very like deep socketed. Some are very shallow, like almost dysplastic. Some are retroverted, some are anteverted. Some are very valgus, some are very varus. Like, so all of the different hip setups are very, very different. And so when you start to look at it through that lens and understand like why some people, when we talk about IR driven or ER driven hip setups, and the same for hitting, right? Like you get a guy that's maybe like an IR, like almost, think almost pigeon toed type guy versus maybe someone that walks more like a duck. That would be a very ER extreme example, but you can at least hopefully see what I'm talking about. But giving those two guys the same coaching cue and the same work would probably elicit different results. It'd probably be really good for one and really bad for the other. So I really tried to like take a step back and say like, okay, what are like the important things? And so we talk about like pec mobility and T-spine mobility and groin mobility and those type of things in terms of making soft tissue gains. So you can kind of drop those into like, okay, everybody's got deadlift today because generally speaking, that's a quality movement for everybody. And at the end of the day, like 90% of everybody needs like 90% of the same stuff. But it's like that last little 10%, if you can kind of turn the dial a little bit, where you might get that exponential gain. And if you're dealing with like a 16-year-old high school kid, yeah, he needs strength. Good job. Like put weight on him, put some strength on him, and he's better. But as they get better and become like professional athletes, it's much harder to make those incremental gains, right? So getting 1% better as a professional athlete that's already really good, like that's way harder than making someone that's 16 like 10% better, right? So it just gets harder the farther you go up the ladder. So in terms of, what did I specifically give guys? For example, if a guy had a really tight groin, we would drop fillers in, whether it be in the weight room or with part of his warm up, some more groin specific activation or mobility, or maybe a guy had really bad ankle mobility. So we would really try to hammer that within the context of his program. So, because there's only so many hours a day, and when you got practice, right? It's like, hey man, I've got 2 hours of field time and here's what we're doing from minute to minute. Like you don't have 30 minutes for guys to work on their ankle mobility. So being able to drop little things into the weight room that those guys needed, and that I felt that they needed on the mound was a big, it was like bonus time is really what it was.
You mentioned right there how one of the things that jumped out with you when during your day job was how, the hips, right, were different, and how, some have different structures and things of that nature. And what I'm kind of curious about is, do you think that every player can have like elite movement, not like velocity or any of that, because a lot of that's out of your control, but just like have really good mechanics? Or is it something that you have to have it a little bit in to begin with, to get to like the elite of the elite?
I think it's a question of good mechanics versus efficient mechanics. Not everybody's mechanics are going to quote unquote be Jacob deGrom and just look like, smooth butter, right? Some guys are just set up different and they're going to be kind of herky jerky, but at the end of the day, they're efficient, right? So I mean, everybody, when Chris Sale came to the league, like everybody thought that guy was going to blow out like in a week, right? And I think, yeah, I think he's coming back from surgery semi recently, but I mean, that dude was dominant for like a decade. And again, scrawny, herky jerky, funky movements. But if you look at, what we call kind of like the pillars, the 7 pillars of an efficient delivery, um, he hits all the checkpoints, right? So it's just a way that his body self-organized into those spots, and it was pretty efficient. It didn't look like everybody else's, and it didn't look clean, so to speak, but you know, everybody's definition of good mechanics are kind of in the eye of the beholder, right? So I think it's very unique to the individual, and finding their ability to find something that's comfortable and semi-repeatable, and it's powerful and efficient. And when we talk about efficient, I mean, obviously sending the energy up the chain the correct way, and hitting all those checkpoints or pillars, and the body will find a way to get there as long as it's able to move there.
Hitting and pitching have very similar movements. So I assume when you're working with hitters, how different are the programs you're giving them versus what you're giving a pitcher? I mean, outside of of course, maybe some of the arm exercises.
Not very, to be honest with you. They're pretty much identical in terms of weight room program. I personally don't work with any hitters in terms of like hitting, even though pitchers are obviously the best hitters. We all know that. Uh, see, Shohei Ohtani. What I mean,
That's right. That's right.
see, but from a weight room perspective and movement quality, like you said, I mean, it's very, very, very similar, and a lot of the same things pop up, whether it's a guy losing like his space in the swing and getting early hip extension and not being able to stay on the inside ball, or it's a pitcher early hip extension and not being able to rotate efficiently and getting into more of like a sliding hip phase instead of like a rotational hip pattern. So it's the same principle, just different. So
What would you do
like you
with
said, the hitters we will let get a little bit more, broed out up top, just because maybe they don't need to generate, your first baseman, and, those guys don't necessarily need to generate, 95 plus all the time. So we'll let them beef up a little bit.
What are there specific exercises you like going to for certain flaws? Like you mentioned, losing space. Like, is there certain like, I want to see him do these specific exercises because I've seen it help in the past.
Yeah, I mean, we'll use things like the core velo belt in terms of whether it's like a warm up, or even if I drop it into their like lifting program. We don't really do the core velo belt too much in their lifting program, but into more of like a warm up context. We use like what's that strap? So it's basically just a big loop that goes around. You can kind of hook it around your upper body. We'll hook it around your hips, and we'll hook it up to we hook it up to our Kaiser machines, but you can hook it up to like a weight stack or even just a band. Just to kind of, what we'll do is we'll try to like isolate the shoulders and have them rotate the hips underneath the torso. So just so that they understand rotating their hips, underneath a fixed torso, versus a lot of times it becomes like one movement. So understanding the disassociation of being able to move your hips underneath your torso, because that's really what creates that like tension, and then the torso kind of follows along with it. So anything where we can create like some cross fascial tensioning, so to speak, where, if we're thinking there's a rubber band from like opposite shoulder to opposite hip, how can we challenge that on the anterior sling? Anything that kind of creates feels just that way, that they can feel it maybe in a slower context where it's loaded. And then they can kind of carry that over into the on-field performance.
One of the things that I've been seeing is what is that machine called? The Proteus?
Proteus. Yep.
Proteus. What do you think of that?
It looks great. I personally don't have one. And one of my buddies, Bill Miller, who's a really good strength coach up in the Chicago area, he just got one and kind of chatted him up. It's a really good, again, it's all about quantifying your ability to rotate, and power output is really what it's all about, right? So being able to measure your power output in a quick, efficient manner has kind of been difficult historically. Like, all right, if you're trying to measure rotational power in the weight room 5 years ago, like how do you do that? Like, you can measure speed of med balls, because we've had radar guns for a while and we've had med balls. So you can do that. Like that's a pretty easy way. But maybe that's not always conducive. So being able to identify where your leaks are, so to speak, is huge, because it just, again, it's all about efficient training. So where's your leaks? How can you attack it? So, and again, I don't have a ton of experience with the Proteus, so I can't speak super in depth on it. But from what I know about it, it seems like a pretty good piece. Obviously, I don't think it's a cheap piece, but
Yeah, I don't think it's a cheap piece either. Well, it's interesting because I saw they came out yesterday, I believe, on social media and said that the majority of the athletes that they've tested are deficient in acceleration and not strength. So kind of similar to what we were talking a little bit about earlier about how they should be, having training at a lighter resistance and higher speeds and not heavy lifting.
yeah. And I think, I mean, if we look at it like, all right, how does and this is maybe like typecasting, but I saw it too much in pro ball for it to not be true. Like, how do these 6'2", 165-pound like Dominicans throw 100 miles an hour? Like, they weren't over there working on their 1 RM, right? Like, they were working on rate of force development. They grooved patterns. They threw they threw like waterlogged balls. And they truthfully, I mean, I talked to a lot of them are my really good friends, and I was like, hey man, like, I was just curious as a player, like, how do you throw 100? Like, you're 150 pounds, man, and like you didn't lift. And they would just be like, man, we went out and played. We would see how far we could throw the ball. They played catch like every day, long toss. They played year round, and they just long tossed, and their arms were just in shape always.
They didn't lift.
They not hardly lift. They would do body weight stuff.
So what are we doing? What are we talking about then?
Well, I think it's a blend of both. I think, could they have benefited maybe from some strength training to a certain extent? Yes. But at the end of the day, it's about power output, right? And so you take the basketball player that's got like a 40-inch bounce, but can't squat his body weight. Like, does that mean he's not a good basketball player? No, it just means that, like, if I teach that guy to squat, we get careful here, but to grass, a lot of those guys struggle, right? And that's just not how they're anatomically set up. Again, going back to the femur life, like, a lot of those guys have really deep socketed femurs, which is really great for some like power output stuff and like the frontal plane, and maybe not being buried deep. But if you look at like a lot of like Olympic lifters and power lifters, a lot of those guys, and Stu McGill is like the godfather of this, but a lot of those guys have more shallow socketed, where they can get into that deep squat where it doesn't really run into like that acetabular rim. So again, if you kind of visualize, you've got like this socket and you've got a really deep C, and like your femur is buried down in there. When I try to go into a deep squat, you can kind of see how like that might not be favorable for like a really deep squat. So, but I can create a lot of tension, and that's really what we're talking about, is like a rubber band, and just being able to create that snapback is obviously how some of those guys create some of that spring. And we talk about like stiffness, and that sounds like a bad thing, but it's really kind of a good thing if it's in the right spots. If you have enough relative stiffness within the context of muscle stiffness, so to speak, that's how you're going to get some of that snapback, versus we don't necessarily want joint stiffness. But
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points there. It makes me think of back when Kevin Durant was doing the pre-draft stuff. Everyone made a big deal that he couldn't bench press 185.
right.
Yeah, and now he's gonna be a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, he's okay. Again, it's skill specific, right? Like, does he need to be able to bench to be a good basketball player? Probably not. Like, do you need to be able to back squat 400 pounds to be a good pitcher? Probably not. So, but there again, it's always kind of a in moderation thing. Too much of something's probably not that great, and not enough probably isn't good either. So trying to find that balance of strength and understanding where you fall on the force velocity curve, and what would be the most beneficial to you to maximize your training time.
How often do you program sprinting?
Every day.
every
we,
day.
we do some version of sprinting every day. We try to make it different in terms of like task focus. And, sometimes we'll put them in push-up positions. Sometimes we'll put them in like side positions. Sometimes we'll start backwards, like a drop step. Sometimes we'll do reactive. Sometimes we'll do, bounds into sprints and lateral, like just basically trying to vary it. Trying to replicate, vary, because a lot of times when those injuries happen, it's a unique situation, right? Like the guy slides into second, he tries to pop up and goes to take off, and maybe like pulls a groin on the turn. So just trying to get out of restricted play where it's like very straight head, very produced, you're going to sprint straight ahead and stop type stuff. Just trying to give them multiple planes of direction and lots of reactive strength and lots of different planes.
Josh, appreciate you coming on, man. It's been a ton of fun. If someone wants to get in contact you, what's the best way?
Yeah, man. So social media, the business side of what we do is at Coach K's Academy, Coach KS Academy. And then I try to put out some more content out of my own stuff. So on Instagram, it's just Josh Kauten, Kauten. And then on Twitter, JUCO, right? So JUCO with a K. So JUKO ACHK. So JUCO Coach K. And it's probably, I think if you just search my name, it hopefully pops up. But social media is probably the best way, or you can always feel free to email me at josh@kstraining.academy.com.
Okay. Well, we'll put those links in the show notes. So appreciate you coming on, man. And again, I've talked to some people who have worked with you, even just remotely. I mean, they say really good things about you, and I know just talking to some other coaches too. I mean, I know you know your stuff, and we appreciate you coming on, just sharing some of your wisdom.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, man. Really like what you do, and keep helping out the guys and providing value, man. And then you do a great job at that.
Appreciate it.